Can South Africa's abstention from the UN General Assembly vote on Russia be seen as support for the aggressor? Well, the South African government released a statement explaining its decision to abstain from a vote to reprimand Russia over the Ukrainian invasion. It reads, and I quote here, "The resolution does not create an environment conducive for diplomacy, dialogue and mediation." End of quote. So what can we read into this decision, and what kind of message does it send out to the international community? Professor Yossi Mekelberg is a senior consulting research fellow at Chatham House and joins us now from London to unpack that. So, Prof, thank you for your time. 141 countries voting in favor of this resolution that calls on Russia to withdraw its forces from Ukraine. Sadly, South Africa is not one of them. Not one of those countries. What have you made of that development, in particular in the explanation by South Africa that the resolution does not create conditions conducive for dialogue and mediation?
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. I really don't understand not only South Africa's stand on this. I don't understand any of those abstained, let alone those who supported Russia, who voted against this resolution. There is no time to abstain. And what is not conducive to negotiation is the behavior of Russia. What is not conducive to negotiation diplomacy is invading another member of the United Nations in complete contravention and violation and brutal violation of the UN Charter. Yes, there is time for diplomacy, needs to be negotiated, and I think what the UN should do is should call for immediate ceasefire. But at this point, when there was an invasion with no any causes belli, to invade a neighboring country just by naked aggression of Putin's Russia, it was the time for every decent country, every decent government, I would say, to condemn the invasion and then talk about creating conditions that are conducive for diplomatic resolution of this conflict.
So, Prof, I don't know how closely you've been following South Africa's navigation of this particular matter, but let me fill you in. What really, compounds my own sense of confusion about it is that in the main thrust of the resolution is to call on Russia to withdraw its forces from Ukraine, which is something that South Africa did on the 24th of February in its own statement, of its own accord and its own initiative, citing the various instruments, including the Charter of the United Nations. So I don't know, is there something in the language of the text that perhaps could be problematic for countries like South Africa, in the sense that perhaps the text emphasizes condemnation of Russia, as opposed to a text that simply says, you're not supposed to be there, pull out immediately?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on South African politics. You probably can enlighten me about that. But I think at this point on history, every country needs to decide whether they're on the right side of history and the wrong side of history. And for me, the right side of history in being complete support of the Ukraine. Yes, when I read the statement by South Africa, yes, you can talk about concerns and security concerns by another country, in this case Russia, about the expansion of NATO. Yeah, can be negotiations about it. But a country doesn't resolve it by invading another country and complete violation of its sovereignty. It doesn't. When Ukraine didn't pose any threats to Russia, you don't do it by committing war crimes against innocent civilians. You don't do it by destroying and other countries and let the tanks rolling into cities and kill and maim and destroy infrastructure, let alone historical monuments. This is not the way to do it. And I think every country, every government should at this point stand against it. Look at the countries that actually oppose the resolution, apart from Russia. Syria, that committed gross war crimes against its own people. North Korea, that commits war crimes and violates the human rights of its own people. So this is even worse. But I think abstaining, not making a resolute decision against what Russia is doing, I think is to be on the wrong side of history.
So what weight, though, does this carry in terms of bringing about some kind of, I don't know, change of trajectory in as far as that conflict is concerned? Because it's non-binding. It's a UN General Assembly resolution as opposed to Security Council resolution, which I do suspect that even if it was, it would have been vetoed by Russia itself.
Completely. I think this demonstrates the general weakness of the United Nations. Again, what happens right now makes a mockery of the collective security architecture of the post-Second World War. And the country that actually committed this gross violation of the UN Charter can veto it in the Security Council. So what's the point of having the Security Council if the offender can veto any resolution? This is one. Two, that's, you know, we forget about how many countries abstained. In reality, the vast majority of members of the United Nations, of the world community, condemn Russia, call Russia to withdraw immediately, but it's not binding. So it's more a declaration of principle. It's more has a moral value and weight. But what it lacks is actually teeth. What it lacks is the ability to enforce it. And I think this shows the weakness of the UN. And it also shows the need that we need an alternative body, collective security that can do that. Let me re-emphasize. If Russia had reservations about, and allowed to have reservation about any country joining NATO so close to its border, by invading the Ukraine, by threatening with nuclear weapons, it's actually proved the point why the Ukraine should be part of NATO, why Poland and Hungary and anyone should be part of NATO, because it's living next to an aggressor.
Lastly, Prof, just on the issue of the pathways, the diplomatic pathways to ending the conflict, or perhaps getting some kind of a ceasefire to actually start substantive negotiations. What's your sense about the prospects of that as Russia and Ukraine have a second take at starting some kind of conversation going?
To be completely honest with you, I'm not that optimistic of an immediate ceasefire. I think there is actually some almost inherent contradiction. The more the Ukraine resists, the more actually the Russian will react with more brutality and aggression, because they won't be seen as losing face or weak. And they expected to move much further, and they don't manage to achieve their war objectives, and as a result, sadly, I think they will use even more force, and they will delay a ceasefire until they get at least to the minimum objective that they set. But I think it should go back and to put more pressure, more sanctions, and I think to keep the international community united. It was not united in the General Assembly as much as I think it should have been, but it's united enough to put more and more pressure on Russia and supporting the forces inside Russia and supporting those who oppose Russia in the Ukraine to force it to move from military aggression into diplomatic negotiations.
What's the likelihood, Prof, that, you know, the longer this goes on, the more it's likely to be the effervescence around it and the international outrage, the effervescence thereof dies down, and it becomes another forgotten conflict. It becomes your Syria, it becomes Yemen, it becomes Iraq and Afghanistan in the latter years of the fighting in those countries?
I fully agree with the assumption that you are making. Sometimes, especially in the age of social media and 24/7 media, our attention span is very short. I think it's for people like yourself and your TV station and for people like myself or provide commentary of that, making sure that this is kept in the public conscious and conscientiousness, awareness. I think this is paramount. What happens right now is is basically undermining the very essence of the international community and peace and security, not only in the Ukraine, but way beyond it, with the threat of by Russia of using nuclear weapons. This can spread very quickly if it's not kept at bay. And I think that's why it's so important for everyone that cares about freedoms and human rights and sovereignty of other countries and peace and stability to keep it day after day, after hour in the public domain.
All right, I've got to thank you for your time and your insights. That's Professor Yossi Mekelberg, who is a Senior Consulting Research Fellow at Chatham House. He was talking to us there from London, weighing in on the situation in Ukraine.